Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Our subject in this episode is altruism, our human desire and instinct to assist each other, making some personal sacrifices along the way. More precisely, our subject is the possible future of altruism, a future in which our philanthropic activities, our charitable donations, and how we spend our discretionary time could have a considerably greater impact than at present. The issue is that many of our present activities, which are intended to help others, aren't particularly effective. That's the judgment reached by our guest today, Stefan Schubert. Stefan is a researcher in philosophy and psychology, currently based in Stockholm, Sweden, and has previously held roles at the LSE and the University of Oxford. Stefan is the co-author of the recently published book, Effective Altruism and the Human Mind, which we'll be discussing shortly. Stefan, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Stefan.
Stefan, what can you tell us about yourself and your co-author, Lucius Caviola? How you met and what made you decide to write this book together?
We met when we both lived in Oxford. Lucius was a PhD student in experimental psychology at Oxford, or a DPhil student, I should say. That's what they call it in Oxford. And I was a researcher at the Center for Effective Altruism. My background is more in philosophy. He was basically studying lay people's views on certain philosophical issues relating to effective altruism, such as why don't people think it's more important to donate effectively. We started talking about this issue, which I found both intellectually stimulating and practically important. One thing led to another, and eventually I joined the lab that he was at, which was led by his supervisor, Nadira Faber. That was in 2018. And then we pursued this empirical research for a couple of years where we did psychological, mostly online experiments, asking people various questions about the importance of donating effectively and their beliefs about the effectiveness of different charities and so on. At some point, we decided now we have enough here together with other people's research to put it all into a book. So that's when we approached Oxford University Press, and then we signed a contract with them. Then we wrote this book for the last couple of years.
So, Stefan, did this research segment the respondents by location, demography, and so on? Did you come away with an understanding of how attitudes towards effective altruism vary around the world?
That's a good question. Many of the studies have US participants. We also use UK participants a bit. So there is a focus on participants from rich Western countries. In fact, towards the end of the book, we list questions for further research. And one of the questions that we list is studying other parts of the world more.
Yeah. And is it broken down by gender and age and things like that?
Yeah, in general, that's something that you do as a matter of routine when you're doing this kind of research, that you're looking at demographic differences. In general, I actually think that those are a bit smaller than many people would think. But there was one set of studies that we did, which may interest you, where we found some demographic differences. We tested lay people's views on a large set of questions which measured people's inclinations toward effective altruism. This was very basic and generic questions. It didn't have anything to do with specific effective altruist charities. It was more questions like, is it important if you can help twice as many people to choose that more effective approach than the less effective approach? And also, do you find it important to give some resources to others, even if they're far away? These kind of very generic statements. When we did that study, we basically identified two psychological factors, which predicted people's inclination towards effective altruism. One was called expansive altruism, that you're willing to share resources with others, including people who are far away, including in time and so on. The other one was effectiveness focus, and this was just what I mentioned, this the feeling that it's important to choose the more effective approaches. If I remember correctly, women were slightly more likely to be expansive altruists, whereas men were slightly more likely to be effectiveness focused. That was one example of a demographic difference that we found. I think also young people might have been more likely to actually be both effectiveness focused and expansive altruist, if I remember correctly. But the overall story is that these demographic differences are somewhat muted. They're not that enormous.
So these differences may not be that large,
Yeah.
but there's a much larger difference, which is the difference in effectiveness of various activities. People may think they are being effective, but in reality, there's a great variety in the impact. So could you talk us through what is meant when we say that activity doesn't have the impact or effect that it might have?
Yeah, so one can mean different things by that, depending on what you find morally important. Let me just start with a simple case which we used in one of our studies, which is just the number of lives that you can save with a given amount of money, like $1 million. A more effective charity is one which can save more lives with this money. We did a study about this where we asked, on the one hand, lay people on online platforms in particular, and on the other hand, global poverty experts. So we asked the following question: how large is the difference in terms of effectiveness, in terms of this life-saving metric, between the most effective global poverty charity and the average global poverty charity? What we found was lay people thought that the difference was 1.5 to 2x, so that the most effective charity is 50 to 100% more effective than the average charity. Whereas the global poverty experts thought that the difference was 100x. It's an enormous difference. Lay people vastly underestimate this difference. But to go back to your question, you might think that this is not the best metric because obviously there are other valuable things in life than saving lives. You can also improve people's lives. And we haven't studied that, how large the difference in effectiveness is between different charities that improve people's lives. But I think there is reason to believe that the difference in effectiveness would be large there as well, because there is an underlying mechanism here which creates this difference. And that is that if you compare charities with for-profit companies that sell to consumers, for-profit companies that sell to consumers, they are under tremendous market pressures. If they aren't effective and if they sell their products at vastly greater prices than their competitors, they will very quickly go out of business. So there's pressure for them to be effective, and therefore the different companies, the prices for their products is compressed into a narrow range. But because charitable donors aren't similarly focused on effectiveness, there isn't the corresponding mechanism, and therefore there's much greater dispersion of effectiveness.
So, Stefan, can I just ask you, if this data presumably is available to the people running the charities
Right.
and presumably also to the large donors to charities,
Yeah.
don't the people who are running the charities which are 100 times less effective, don't they think, oh, we really better change our business model?
That's a good question. In this context, I should make one clarification. This whole question of effective charity, you can approach it from different angles. We approach it from the perspective of the donor psychology, but we have not really looked into the side of the charities themselves. I can only speculate here, but I guess in many cases, many charities, they have their chosen cause, and they might not be very happy with relinquishing that cause, and they might also just not know about this. What you said that this data is publicly available, well, it's the belief of these global poverty experts, but not everyone might accept that that's the case.
So you think the people running the less effective charities might be very skeptical about what the experts are saying? They'd just ignore the data.
Yeah, it's possible. But I want to emphasize that this is not something that I've looked into and is not what our book is about.
So, can you share some more of the findings from your book, the things that people may be surprised at?
And I could tell you about the overall explanation of why people's donations aren't more effective. Basically, we think that there's three different factors that play into that. And in particular, I want to emphasize the third factor because there's a sort of standard model in the social sciences that people often use when they want to explain behavior, not just charitable giving, but other kinds of behavior as well. And that's a belief desire model where you say, well, on the one hand, the problem is that people have erroneous beliefs. In this case, about charities, they just don't know what the most effective charities are. That's something that we found in our studies, that the effective altruist charities that have been recommended as highly effective, people mostly didn't know about them. And then the other thing is on the desires or the feeling side, people feel very strongly for certain causes or certain charities. Cancer research would be one example. So sometimes in some studies, people have found that even if you tell people that another charity is more effective, they still want to donate to this charity that they feel strongly for. Those two factors are kind of straightforward and commonly mentioned, but we want to emphasize that those two factors are in themselves not enough, because in other contexts, people are able to overcome these two obstacles, as you might call them. Civil servants, for instance, they might also be initially ignorant of what's effective in a particular domain, but they learn about it. And also, they might have personal feelings for specific strategies, but they learn that other strategies are more effective, then they typically are able to overcome that. So we need to add a third factor, and that is that the norms for civil servants and for charitable donors are different. For a civil servant, there's a norm that you're supposed to be effective, whereas for charitable donors, there's no corresponding norm. The view is, well, it's fine to donate wherever your heart leads you. So that's the mindset that people have in charity.
I think we see some of that in the pushback sometimes observed about effective altruism. People want to say, how dare you tell me, you effective altruists, how I should spend my money?
Right.
I want to follow my heart, and I prefer to look after the people that inspire me,
Yeah.
rather than caring about some academically conceivable outcome.
Right. That is true. You see some online criticisms of effective altruism. I think that if you go to the wider public, most people haven't actually heard about effective altruism. And my sense is often when people hear about it, it's not that they're actively hostile to it. I would also say that in general, people actually like the idea of effectiveness. Often when they're asked, what are your criteria for choosing a charity? Then they say effectiveness is important. So it's not like people are directly averse to effectiveness, but they just don't want to go as far as the effective altruists go.
Stefan, you say that people like effectiveness, and clearly in the abstract, that's got to be true. But it does seem to me there is a huge backlash against the community, to the extent it is a community of effective altruism. And it's a backlash I frankly don't understand. I can't imagine why anybody would want a charity or a set of charities to become less effective or not to be as effective as they can. But it is there. And when Sam Bankman-Fried suffered his downfall, there was an enormous amount of schadenfreude that this geeky, effective altruist got his comeuppance. There's been a lot of negative press, at least among the commentariat, the people who are paid to have opinions. They love the fact that EA is taking a slap. And I'm quite puzzled. And I suppose it's part of populism, because effective altruists tend to be very highly educated people who are trying to make the world a better place. They are the classic do-gooders. and the commentariat love to take them down. It seems to me a terribly sad phenomenon. You must have experienced that in your own life, surely.
Right. First of all, for the listeners, I think it's important to distinguish between this more abstract idea of doing good effectively and the effective altruism movement as a sociological group. I was talking about people liking the idea of doing good effectively. But then there's another issue of how they like the specific embodiment of this ideal within the effective altruism movement. And yeah, it is true that among some people there have been a lot of acerbic commentary. That's unfortunate. I guess to some extent it's also something that other movements also experience. So it's just part of contemporary culture, unfortunately, I guess.
Isn't part of the backlash against some naive interpretation of utilitarianism that you can do anything so long as the outcome is good? So you can go and encourage people to work in financial services, make lots of money, and hopefully they'll still be altruistically minded at the end. Whereas in reality, this is the lesson of all of ethics and philosophy throughout history. If you let virtues slide, you end up losing track of the big picture as well. You end up being a much more materialistic, grasping person.
Right. You mentioned an interesting term there, naive effective altruism. It's also sometimes associated with the erroneous idea that it's fine to commit crimes or otherwise engage in nefarious activities for the greater good. And I think there are two things to be said there. One is that some critics of effective altruism exaggerate the strawman effective altruism as having that attitude, which I don't think is the case. But at the same time, I also think that this is something that effective altruists do actually need to be on the lookout for and do need to warn about, even more so after these unfortunate events with FTX.
FTX was the company or the organization that Sam Bankman Fried founded, and he used it to transfer significant monies into effective altruist causes.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. I have actually, together with Lucius Caviola, whom I wrote this book with, we've also done this work on virtues for effective altruists, where we've argued that it's important for effective altruists to cultivate virtues that would make it more likely for you that you make the right decision, even if you're under emotional pressure. If you over time cultivated certain habits to react in a certain way, then it might be more likely that you make the right decision when time comes for a high stakes decision. So I do think that perspective is important.
So the conversation I really want to have is that Callum and I both have various causes that we'd like to see advanced in the world. I care about, for example, solution of aging, because I feel that aging is the root cause of many terrible diseases. Aging, if we solve that, might eliminate cancer and dementia and so on. Also, I care passionately about controlling AI, that AI should be developed safely. But as I see what people spend their money on around the world, a lot of it to me doesn't seem to be that effective. People are, for whatever reasons, from their past history, from their incentives, they seem to be spending money in less effective ways. So, what is your advice based on all that you've researched and written in the book as to how we can get more of the world spending more of its discretionary money on causes that will make the biggest difference?
The short answer is, unfortunately, I think it's quite hard because you have these fairly strong norms relating to charity, that charity is not a domain in which you need to be very effective. With regards to strategies, I do actually think that the strategy that the effective altruism movement has used and slowly tried to build the movement and get people really engaged, that it makes a lot of sense, in part because to actually be effective, it's quite hard. You need to acquire a lot of knowledge and you need to stay motivated and so on, because there are many ways in which you can do something that appears to be somewhat effective but actually isn't very effective. But if you go regularly to EA meetups or otherwise are involved in the effective altruism community, then you might learn more about what concrete opportunities actually are most effective, and you might talk to others and so on. So I do think that that makes sense. Obviously, that's a fairly slow approach. The EA movement isn't growing very quickly, but we haven't identified any brilliant shortcut in our research, unfortunately.
I would have thought there's some really big messages that effective altruism could try to convey.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure that the movement is in a position to do this at the moment. It still seems to me very much on the back foot. But if it wanted to, for instance, David mentioned addressing aging and treating aging as a disease and trying to cure it.
Right.
Almost everybody thinks it's a really good idea to cure cancer, a really good idea to cure or to arrest mental decline as people get older, and a really good idea to cure heart disease. Now, if you were to cure all those three things, you would take away many of the effects of aging, which kill everybody. Those are the three biggest killers. Alternatively, you could address aging directly. And if you stop people aging, they will not get those diseases because they are diseases of aging. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's broadly speaking true. But if you say to most people, why don't we address aging as a disease? They say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. It's right and proper that we get old and that we die.
Right.
And we shouldn't try to stop it. And yet they're all busy trying to stop cancer, heart attack, and dementia. So that is a cognitive bias that people have, which really should be addressed.
Yeah.
Because we are being massively inefficient with healthcare and with research into making lives better as people get older. That's the sort of thing I would have thought EA could really mount a full frontal assault on.
Right. You're right in your analysis of this argument. But even if the error might seem fairly straightforward, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that it's straightforward to address it. And I guess people who work on aging, they've been trying to give this argument for years. Effective altruists don't have a secret bullet that people who work on aging who are not effective altruists don't have. Unfortunately, it is in many ways harder to convince people of some seemingly straightforward propositions than you might think.
Sadly, I think that's right.
One thing that can change people's mind is some kind of demonstration, some clear statistics. In the early days of effective altruism, there was a fascinating statistic about deworming, which I know has been a lot of controversy afterwards. But in the beginning, it seemed to be a very striking result. That if you spend money helping deal with worm infestation in children in parts of Africa, this had an enormous impact on helping people to spend more time in school and their lives went better.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one highlight which made a difference. In the anti-aging field, we're all looking for a treatment that can significantly extend the lives of mice or dogs. Humans will take longer to demonstrate because it takes a lot longer to figure out that somebody can live to 150 years if they do such and such a thing. Are there any other tipping points that could change the trajectory of effective altruism from a slow build-up that you've discussed with some setbacks along the way to having more of a, what should we call it, a 9/11 moment? Maybe that's the wrong analogy.
A Sputnik moment.
A Sputnik moment, or when Wilbur Wright demonstrated that he could actually fly in loops of 8 in Le Mans outside Paris.
Even better, yeah.
And suddenly all the skeptics decided that this aviation thing was for real after all.
That's a good question. Sometimes endorsements by some individuals could be very important and significant, especially if it's a person with lots of resources, and then one thing could lead to another. But the current trajectory doesn't look like that. It's been a more flat trajectory more recently, I would say.
In terms of a public figure who might cause a change in public attitude, there's Elon Musk.
Right.
He now has DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, which sounds a lot like Department of Government Effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility that when people are examining norms, shall we say, in the light of Trump's rise to power again, that people will be more open to saying, well, actually, what does make a difference here? How can we have a bigger bang for our buck?
I think there is a difference between the charity sector and the government. I said this about the civil servants previously, how they are supposed to overcome their psychological obstacles to effectiveness. This department of government efficiency, in some ways that's new, but in other ways it's just the continuation of a long tradition you've had in the UK and many other countries, this focus on evidence-based policy. This is something that people find important, and they're often very outraged when governments aren't seen as effective. But again, I'm not sure whether that flows over to charity because people just have a different attitude to that.
And what are your own preferred philanthropic causes, Stefan? What do you give money to or time?
Basically, I would identify two. One is the long-term future. I think that it's very important to make sure that the long-term future goes well. This is one of the most prominent causes that many effective altruists focus on. There could be different ways that you could try to influence the long-term future, but one way would be to prevent an existential catastrophe. So an existential catastrophe would be either human extinction or a catastrophe so large that we could never recover from it. That's important from a long-termist perspective because if there's an existential catastrophe, then the long-term future would never come into existence. In practice, many effective altruists think that risks from artificial intelligence or biological risks, those are the ones that one needs to prioritize. So I think it makes sense to work on those risks, even though that's not what I personally work on currently. And then the other thing is what's effective altruists called meta. And that is what I work on. It's trying to spread the effective altruist message and trying to improve the health of the movement because one thinks that this is an important mindset which indirectly can help other causes if you spread these mindsets. That is what I have been working on personally for many years.
And what is your P-doom, Stefan? What's your guess about the likelihood of superintelligence wiping us out?
I don't have a specific number to give you, but I'm maybe not quite as pessimistic as some people are. You could see P-doom as a function of at least two factors. The one is facts about these technologies, how hard they are to control, and so on. And the other is our societal response to these risks. And my view has been that some people are a bit too pessimistic about this societal response. And in fact, it's already the case that many people who work on AI, not least from the EA community, who work on AI safety, they say that they've been surprised by the extent to which governments have already taken an interest in that. And that seems to point in the direction that people were a bit too pessimistic in the past. And I might think they're still being too pessimistic.
So do you think that when a superintelligence arises, there is any chance that humans will be able to affect the outcome?
Now, I don't know exactly how this scenario will pan out, but in general, I think that if there is a big risk, then people are often able to address it one way or another. If it turns out to be the case that a certain scenario is almost uncontrollable, people will potentially know that in advance and try to do something about it. I don't want to speculate on the specific pathways, but I am a bit more optimistic about institutions and other actors' responses than some people are.
So you're like David, because David is clinging on to the hope that we can either stop developing very advanced AIs or that we can align them or something. I'm pretty convinced that once superintelligence arises, then we are the chimpanzees and the matter is out of our hands. I'm not convinced that the Elias of Yudkowskis of the world and the Conor Lees of the world are right, that necessarily means extinction. I don't see why it's not entirely possible that superintelligence could want to help us, but I don't think we're going to be able to influence the outcome. I'm always interested to know how people think we might. I'm very curious to know from people who don't think that we are going to become the powerless chimpanzees in the situation, why they think that.
I don't want to go into the details of this AI endgame because that's something I lack.
Fair enough. I realize that's a bit off topic for you.
Well, let me come back to the meta topic then.
Uh-huh.
How could effective altruism be more effective? How could it be more successful?
Yeah.
And one suggestion is to avoid talking about long-termism, because there are many people who are sympathetic to the idea of being more effective and figuring out how to avoid catastrophes, but they are allergic to the suggestion that the lives of trillions of people in the far future somehow mean we should care much less about starving people today, or the victims of the war in Sudan and Ukraine and Gaza and so forth. So to what extent is there a live discussion within the meta community in EA as to whether to downplay the long-termism or instead to double down on it?
It's a somewhat tricky question, because if people actually work on something, it's kind of hard to downplay it. The facts are what they are, what people within EA are working on. There's only so much that one can do with how one frames what one does. Of course, then you could argue that people should actually work on different things. But presumably these people who work on long-termist causes, they just arrived at the conclusion that this is highly effective.
It's in how it gets messaged. If people do research on EA and the first thing they come across is long-termism, it might dissuade them.
Yeah.
We have a similar discussion in the field of transhumanism.
Mm-hmm.
Should we highlight transhumanism, or should we talk more about, hey, there's the possibility of having longer, healthier lives? There's a recommendation to not lead with transhumanism. It's a T for toxic word.
Right.
You won't dissuade people, I think, who are committed on long-termism from working on long-termism, but maybe the movement as a whole can emphasize catastrophic risks rather than existential risks.
Right. It depends a bit on what the reframing amounts to. If there's a particular word that has negative associations, certainly one can avoid that. But I guess I just want to emphasize that if one works on something, then one can't hide that. One needs to be upfront about what one actually believes.
But the movement as a whole could take a decision to prioritize some messages rather than others.
Yeah. But again, those messages, they can't be misleading.
Sure.
So that's one factor to take into account.
My final question would be, how has your book been received? Are you happy with the reception? Are people criticizing it fairly, or is it not yet having the ripples you foresaw?
We are happy. We've received positive feedback. It's an academic book on a somewhat specialized topic, so of course it has a somewhat more narrow audience. But at the same time, I do want to emphasize that it's not a difficult read. It's like a textbook, so it's accessible to anyone, and you don't need a background in psychology.
Well, thanks, Stefan. You've given us a lot to think about. The question of how to be more effective, as you said, is a hard question. And it's one we should keep reflecting on, not just at individual level, but at the meta level. I look forward to seeing how effective altruism does transition and grow in the years ahead so that more of society's thoughtfulness, resources, and money can be applied in ways that will bring about a better world sooner and more reliably.
I suspect that effective altruism will make a strong comeback once the current wave of right-wing populism recedes, if it ever does. Thank you very much for joining us on the London Futurist podcast, Stefan.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Callum. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.